The sprinklers had shut off 20 minutes ago, and the grass still glistened under the sodium lights lining the 18th fairway. Brock Halloway walked it the way he walked it every night, slow, methodical, checking for divots the day's golfers had left behind. 68 years old, and his knees told him about every one of them on nights like this, when the September air turned the ground damp and cold. Club Paradise was silent in a way it never was during daylight. No clink of ice in glasses, no laughter carrying across the greens, no distant thwack of a driver making contact. Just his own footsteps and the low hum of the security lights out by the clubhouse. He was halfway to hole 9 when he heard it. A shifting, low, wet, coming from somewhere beneath the ground itself, like something enormous rolling over in its sleep. Brock stopped walking. He told himself it was pipes. The old irrigation system was original to the course, installed back when Eisenhower was in office, and it groaned and settled sometimes when the temperature dropped. That was all. Pipes. Then he saw the ball. It sat alone in the middle of the green, pale under the lights, and Brock frowned. Golfers didn't leave balls behind, not the ones who played here. He started toward it, already composing the complaint he'd log in the morning. The ball moved. Not rolled by wind. There was no wind tonight. The air hung still and heavy, but rolled, deliberate, 3 feet to the left, then stopped just past the edge of his vision near the fringe. Brock's mouth went dry. He stood very still, the way he had as a boy when he thought he'd heard something in the woods behind his grandfather's house, waiting for the silence to prove him wrong. The shifting came again, closer this time. He felt it more than heard it, a vibration traveling up through the soles of his boots.
Hello?
His own voice sounded thin to him, swallowed by the dark. Nothing answered. But the ball had stopped rolling now, resting at the lip of a shadow he didn't remember being there. He crossed the last stretch of green toward it, his flashlight beam trembling slightly in his grip, and it was only when he was standing over it that he saw the hole, not a cup, not anything the course had installed. A ragged black opening in the earth, easily 3 feet wide, the grass around its edges torn rather than cut. Brock's stomach dropped. He should have turned around right then. He would think that later, in the half second he had left to think anything at all. Instead, he crouched down, reaching for the ball resting just inside the rim. The claw came out of the dark so fast he never made a sound. It closed around his forearm, and the ground swallowed him whole. By the time the dirt settled back into place, smooth and undisturbed, there was nothing left to say he'd ever been there at all. Chris Bellamy had been employed at Club Paradise for exactly 11 hours, and already he understood why the parking lot out back was reserved for staff instead of guests. The guest lot up front had actual landscaping, manicured hedges shaped like chess pieces, a fountain that probably cost more than his Camaro. He clipped his temporary badge to his collar and tried not to look as out of place as he felt. "You're going to want to lose the enthusiasm," said the voice behind him. "Members can smell it on you." Chris turned to find a lanky guy about his own age leaning against the pro shop doorway, aviators pushed up into sandy hair, a canvas bag of clubs slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing, a Walkman clipped to his belt with the headphones looped around his neck. "Wayne," he said, sticking out a hand. "I'm training you today, apparently. Lucky me." Chris. I know, it's on the schedule board. Wayne nodded toward the corkboard by the pro shop door, index cards pinned in careless rows. Come on, we're on the back 9 and 10 minutes, and Mr. Castellano hits the ball like he's mad at it. Heads up, you hear anything about Brock this morning? Chris shook his head. Old guy, does the greens at night, didn't show up for his shift, which... Wayne glanced sideways at him, something unreadable crossing his face for a second before it smoothed back into easy amusement. That's not that weird around here, honestly. People just don't last. You'll see. Define don't last. Quit mostly. Sometimes just stop showing up. No notice, nothing. Wayne shrugged like it cost him nothing to say it, but his shoulders had gone a little stiff. Turnover's brutal. I'm actually out myself next week. Got something lined up at a course over in Charleston. Better tips, normal people. They rounded the cart barn, past a row of carts with a boombox propped on a shelf just inside, playing something with a lot of synthesizer, and Chris nearly walked into one pulling out from the shade. A girl about his age behind the wheel, dark hair pulled back, a row of jelly bracelets stacked on one wrist, sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the sharp way her eyes swept over both of them before she smiled, polite and quick, and pulled away toward the clubhouse. Sissy, Wayne said before Chris could ask. Cart girl, started last week. She seems... Chris tried to find the word. Fine? For now. Wayne's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. Give it time. Nobody sticks around long enough for it to matter. The morning went the way mornings did. Bags carried, clubs handed off, comments about lie and distance murmured just loud enough to be heard. By early afternoon, the sun sat high and mean over the back 9, and Mr. Castellano's drive on 15 sliced hard right, arcing over the trees and vanishing with a soft, distant plop into the pond bordering the fairway.
Unacceptable,
Castellano muttered, already reaching for another ball from his bag. Wayne sighed, low enough only Chris could hear it. Rules say we don't go in after him. Water hazard's a lost ball. That's golf. He glanced toward Castellano, already knowing how this would go, then back at Chris. But guys like him don't care what the rules say. Watch and learn. He crossed the grass toward the water's edge, and just as he crouched at the bank, a voice barked out from the cart path behind them.
Bellamy. Office. Now.
The man striding toward them wore a security uniform a size too tight across the shoulders, a walkie-talkie crackling low static at his hip, and a smile that didn't move the rest of his face. Henry, according to the name badge. Chris had seen him twice that morning already, always at the edge of things, always watching.
Paperwork's wrong on your I-9,
Henry said, already turning to walk back toward the clubhouse, clearly expecting Chris to follow.
Can't have you on the clock without it. Won't take long.
Chris glanced back at Wayne, who waved him off with a lazy hand. Go. I got this. It didn't take long. Henry was right about that at least. 10 minutes of Chris rewriting a date he was fairly certain he'd written correctly the first time, Henry standing over his shoulder the entire time, close enough that Chris caught the smell of stale coffee and something else underneath it, something faintly sour he couldn't place. When Chris finally stepped back out into the sun, Wayne was nowhere on the 15th fairway. Mr. Castellano stood alone at the water's edge, red-faced, checking his watch.
"Where's the other one?"
Castellano snapped when Chris got close enough.
"The caddy. Told him to fetch my ball 10 minutes ago and he just wandered off. Unbelievable."
Chris looked past him at the pond. Still, smooth as glass, the ball nowhere in sight, no sign that Wayne had ever crouched at that bank at all, no bag, nothing. A single ring of ripples touched the reeds at the far edge and faded. Maybe he went to get help, Chris offered, though something cold was already settling low in his stomach. Castellano scoffed and stalked off toward the clubhouse to complain, and Chris stood there a moment longer, staring at water that gave nothing back. By the time his shift ended, nobody had seen Wayne. The staff board still had his name on it for tomorrow's tea times, like nothing was wrong at all. He found Sissy near the cart barn, wiping down the dash of her cart with a rag, the boombox nearby playing low. She looked up when he approached, and something in his face must have told her, because her easy smile faded before he even said a word. "Let me guess," she said. "Another one." Chris didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sissy reached into the pocket of her shorts and pulled out a small spiral notebook, its cover plastered with band stickers gone soft and peeling at the edges, and clicked her pen. "That's 4, she muttered, writing something down. "In a week and a half." The days that followed had a strange, slippery quality to them, one blurring into the next, the club running exactly as it always had, as if nothing were missing at all. Wayne's name disappeared from the schedule board within a week, replaced quietly by another trainee's. When Chris asked about it, the assistant pro just shrugged. "Happens. Guy probably found something better." Nobody mentioned the shoes. Chris found out about those from Sissy 3 days later, both of them killing time in the shade behind the cart barn, while a Duran Duran song hissed tinny and thin out of her boombox. She'd been the one to find them, tucked in the grass near the pond, laces still tied, like Wayne had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into nothing. "I gave them to the office," she said, picking at the frayed hem of her shorts. "Lost and found box. Nobody even blinked." By then, Chris had learned enough of the club's rhythms to notice what he hadn't before, how often certain names came up and then quietly stopped coming up at all. A groundskeeper, a dishwasher, someone in the pro shop he'd only met once. Sissy's little spiral notebook was filling up fast, the band stickers on its cover curling further at the corners each time she pulled it from her pocket to add another line. Her trainer, a beverage cart girl named Mel, who wore a visor low over sharp, tired eyes and had been at Club Paradise longer than almost anyone, went next. She didn't even call out, Sissy told him, quieter than usual, the humor gone from her voice entirely. Her cart still parked behind the 9th hole, coolers still full of ice. They didn't have a name for what was happening. Not yet, but by the 2nd week, they'd started eating lunch together on the loading dock behind the kitchen instead of the staff room, close enough to talk low, far enough that nobody could overhear them comparing notes. It was Sissy who first said it out loud. "You ever notice Henry's always around? Like, everywhere, whenever something's off." Chris thought of the sour smell in the office, the too tight uniform, the way Henry had steered him away from the pond that first day without ever quite explaining why the paperwork couldn't wait. He hadn't thought about it since. He was thinking about it now. Their conversation cut short when a woman's voice rose sharp and furious from inside the clubhouse bar, carrying out through the propped open door.
I want to speak to the manager, right now!
Chris and Sissy exchanged a look and drifted closer, drawn in like everyone else nearby. The woman at the bar was maybe 50, dressed head to toe in tennis whites, despite never having set foot on a court, jabbing a manicured finger at the bartender, Julie, according to her name tag, who was already reaching for the phone with a tight, practiced smile.
My caddy went to fetch my ball out of bounds and never came back.
The woman snapped.
Just left his shoes sitting there in the grass, like it's some kind of joke. I paid good money for a service. Is this how you treat your guests?
Julie murmured an apology, already moving to walk the woman toward the manager's office, and the bar emptied back out into its usual quiet hum. Chris looked at Sissy. Sissy looked at Chris. "Tonight?" she said, low. "After closing, we're done waiting for someone else to explain this to us." Midnight found them standing at the edge of Hole 1, the clubhouse dark and silent behind them, security lights casting long yellow pools across grass that looked almost silver under the moon. Sissy had the Polaroid slung around her neck on its strap, a fresh cube of flashbulbs loaded and ready. Neither of them had said much on the walk out here. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said. "We split up," Sissy said finally, voice low even though there was no one to hear them. "Cover more ground. Meet back here in 20 minutes, whether we find anything or not." 20 minutes, Chris repeated, like saying it back might make it feel less insane. She squeezed his arm once, quick, and then she was moving off toward the back 9, her sneakers silent on the wet grass, and Chris was alone with nothing but a flashlight and the sound of his own heartbeat. The course felt different at night. Wrong, somehow, in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't stood here in the dark themselves. The shadows too deep, the quiet too complete, like the whole property was holding its breath. He found the first print near Hole 3. It stopped him cold, flashlight beam trembling slightly over a depression pressed deep into the soft earth just off the cart path, too large to be any animal he knew, 4 long gouges raked out from a broad pad, claws that had sunk half an inch into ground that should have held nothing heavier than a golf shoe. He crouched beside it, throat tight, and followed the trail with his light. 3 more prints evenly spaced, deep with purpose. Then nothing. The trail simply stopped, mid-stride, as if whatever made it had simply lifted straight up into the air. Chris stood there a long moment, flashlight sweeping the empty dark around him, sweat gone cold on the back of his neck. Across the course, Sissy had reached Hole 4 when she noticed the flag. It hung wrong, leaning hard to one side, the fabric drooping despite the still night air, like something had brushed against the pole and never bothered to right it. She approached slowly, camera raised, thumb resting light against the shutter. The ground near the cup shifted. She froze. Not wind, not an animal settling into the grass. A slow, deliberate movement, like something breathing just beneath the surface. A mound of pale cloth pushed up out of the cup itself, catching the moonlight, and Sissy's stomach dropped somewhere she'd never felt it drop before. She stepped closer, camera forgotten at her side, and crouched down beside it with fingers that had gone numb. A shirt. Club Paradise staff polo, the fabric torn at one sleeve, dark stains blooming across the collar that the moonlight rendered black instead of red. Embroidered above the pocket. Mel. Sissy's breath left her in a single silent rush. She didn't hear the shifting beneath the earth start again, closer now until it was already too late. The ground erupting beside her in a spray of loose dirt, and a hand shot out of the hole and closed around her forearm, clawed fingers digging deep and yanked. The scream tore across the dark before Sissy even knew she'd made it, the clawed hand dragging her toward the widening hole with a strength that felt less like muscle and more like gravity itself had turned against her. She kicked, twisted, drove her heel hard into whatever lay just beneath the surface, and heard something guttural and furious answer back from underground. Her hand found the pocket knife clipped inside her waistband, the one Chris had pressed into her palm their second week, laughing it off as just in case, my grandpa's superstitious, and she wrenched it free, blade flashing once in the moonlight before she buried it, hilt deep into the back of the hand gripping her arm. The howl that followed didn't sound like anything that belonged on a golf course in South Carolina. Chris found her like that, mid-scream, half swallowed by the earth, one hand white-knuckled around a knife buried in something that shouldn't exist. He didn't think. He dropped his flashlight and grabbed her by the waist, throwing his whole weight backward, and for one terrible second it was a tug of war, with something on the other end that didn't tire, didn't loosen its grip, didn't behave like anything alive should. His hand closed around the fallen flashlight. He didn't have a plan, just instinct, just do something, and he swung the beam directly into the hole. The creature's shriek this time was different, higher, wounded in a way the knife hadn't managed. The clawed hand spasmed, fingers convulsing, and Sissy felt the grip loosen just enough to rip herself free, both of them collapsing backward into the wet grass as the hand withdrew into the earth and the hole sealed itself shut behind it, grass knitting back together like a wound closing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sissy's camera lay a few feet away, and with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, Chris picked it up, aimed it at the patch of disturbed dirt, and pressed the shutter. The flash went off white and sudden in the dark, and where light touched a thin trail of black fluid seeping up from the ground, it began to steam. Bubble, curdle in on itself like something being actively burned. Light, Sissy breathed, staring at the Polaroid sliding out of the camera, developing slowly in her trembling hand. It hurts them. They didn't talk much on the walk back to the clubhouse. Couldn't, really. Every sound in the dark now felt like it might be something else, something worse. Chris let them in through the staff entrance, and they found the employee lounge by feel more than memory, easing the door shut behind them before he finally clicked on the small lamp by the coffee machine. Sissy's forearm was a mess, 4 deep gouges, dark blood already drying at the edges, and Chris found the first aid kit under the sink, hands still not quite steady as he unwound gauze and pressed it gently to the wound. "This is real," she said quietly, watching him work, like she was still trying to convince herself. "This is actually happening." "Yeah." He tied off the bandage, sat back on his heels. "So, what do we do with that?" Neither of them had an answer. The lounge was silent except for the hum of the vending machine in the corner, the faint tick of a wall clock shaped like a golf ball that Chris hadn't noticed until just now. Then, from the corridor outside, voices. Low, familiar, drawing closer. Sissy's eyes went wide. They weren't supposed to be here. And whoever was coming, they both recognized exactly who it was. There was no time to think, only to move. Chris killed the lamp and they slipped out of the lounge on silent feet, the voices in the corridor growing closer with every second. Sissy grabbed his sleeve and pulled him toward the only door standing open nearby, and they slid inside just as footsteps rounded the corner behind them. The owner's office, dark, wood-paneled, smelling faintly of cigar smoke and old leather. They wedged themselves behind the couch in the far corner just as the door swung open and the overhead light snapped on.
And how many guests, exactly?
Mr. Sam Guess's voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man discussing quarterly earnings rather than anything that should have made his tone drop like it did.
Mrs. Calder was the last one. Right after she complained about her caddy, if you can believe it.
Good.
A pause, the creak of a chair, the clink of ice in a glass.
The cellar door, has it been fixed?
Yes, sir. Bolted it myself this afternoon.
I don't want anyone wandering into those tunnels by accident. Understood?
Understood.
Sissy's fingers dug into Chris's arm hard enough to bruise, and neither of them dared breathe until the light snapped off again and the door clicked shut, footsteps retreating down the hall until the building fell silent once more. They stayed frozen a full minute longer before either of them moved. "He knows," Sissy whispered, barely audible. "He's known this whole time." Dawn wasn't far off now, the sky outside the office window already beginning to pale at its edges, and they both understood without saying it that whatever they did next, they had to do quickly. "I'm going to find my cousin," Chris said, low and fast. "He works part-time at the paper in Charleston. If I get real proof, real photos, we blow this whole thing wide open. But I need more than a burned hand and a bad feeling. Then I'll search the office. There's got to be paperwork, records, something." Sissy hesitated. "I don't like you going alone." "I don't like it either, but you're better in here than out there, and I need to know you're safe." He managed something almost like a smile. Divide and conquer. He crossed to the shelf by the window to grab a flashlight sitting among a row of trophies and stopped. A thin seam of light traced along the shelf's back edge, faint but unmistakable, where there shouldn't have been any light at all. He pulled at it, and the whole shelf swung outward on a hidden hinge, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Sissy's breath caught. "Chris!" "I'll be careful." He squeezed her hand once, then started down into the dark, and within seconds, the shadows had swallowed him whole. Sissy turned back to the office, heart hammering, and went straight for the heavy oak desk in the corner. The bottom drawer was locked. She dug her knife from her waistband and worked the blade into the seam, twisting until the lock gave with a loud scrape that made her wince and freeze, listening. Nothing stirred. Inside sat a metal lockbox, and it took her another minute of careful prying before the latch finally popped free. Documents, dozens of them, dates, names, payments, a list far too long and far too organized to be anything but exactly what she feared. "Gotcha," she breathed, the words slipping out before she could stop it. A hand closed over her mouth from behind. "Gotcha," a voice echoed back, low and pleasant, right against her ear. The tunnels went deeper than Chris had expected, the packed dirt walls smooth and strangely uniform, like something had carved them with purpose rather than clawed them out in a frenzy. His flashlight beam was the only light down here, a thin white cone swallowed almost instantly by the dark pressing in from every side. He tore pages from his notebook as he walked, crumpling each one and letting it fall behind him, a trail he could follow back out, assuming he made it that far. The tunnel forked again. He was losing track of turns already, the passage widening into something that felt less like a tunnel and more like a den. That was when he started finding things. A single sneaker half buried in the dirt, a canvas tote bag strap torn clean through, a watch, its face cracked, still ticking. And then, his flashlight catching the fabric before his mind caught up to what he was seeing. A staff polo, dark stains long since dried to black, Wayne stitched neatly above the pocket. Chris's hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the light. A low growl rolled out of the dark ahead of him, deep enough that he felt it in his chest before he consciously heard it. He swung the flashlight up and the beam caught eyes. Two of them, low to the ground, catching the light and throwing it back, amber yellow. Then more, rising, unfolding out of the shadows into something huge, black, scaled, claws longer than his fingers, a shape that didn't belong anywhere on earth he'd ever stood on. Two more emerged behind it. Chris backed into the tunnel wall, flashlight beam trembling wildly as the creatures advanced, slow and certain, herding him into the dead-end curve of the passage. His camera was still slung around his neck. He raised it with hands that barely obeyed him and fired the flash directly into the nearest creature's face. It shrieked, recoiling, skin bubbling where the light struck it, and Chris didn't wait to see more. He ran, flashlight flicking on and off in short bursts to conserve what little battery he had left, footsteps pounding through a maze he could no longer be certain he remembered correctly. Sissy woke to the smell of wet earth and the throb of her bandaged arm pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She was sitting upright, wrists chained to a brick wall slick with condensation, and it took her several disoriented seconds to understand what she was looking at. The walls around her weren't walls at all, but the curved interior of some vast chamber, and the floor was covered, wall to wall, with leathery gray-white eggs the size of beach balls, pulsing faintly in a rhythm she didn't want to think too hard about. She yanked hard against the chains. They didn't give an inch.
Wouldn't bother,
said a familiar voice, and Henry stepped out of the shadows, smiling the same smile he always wore, like none of this was any different from checking a badge at the front gate. He was holding her Polaroid camera, turning it over once in his hands before letting it drop and grinding his heel into it until the plastic cracked.
We can't let anyone find out now, can we?
You knew. Her voice came out raw. This whole time, you knew.
Of course I knew.
He crouched down to her eye level, unhurried.
I keep this place running. Somebody has to.
He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and she jerked away as far as the chains allowed.
You lasted longer than most, you know. 2 whole weeks. I almost hate to see it end.
Her knife sat on a low stone shelf a few feet away, close enough to see, impossibly far to reach. Somewhere above them, a howl rose, then another and another, joined by the fast, heavy rhythm of something enormous running, drawing closer through the tunnels with every passing second. Henry's smile didn't waver. He just tilted his head, listening like a man checking the time. The burning had started somewhere around her elbow, and by now it had crept halfway up her bicep, a deep, pulsing heat that had nothing to do with fever, threading dark lines beneath her skin like ink spreading through water. Sissy stared at it in the dim light, cold sweat breaking across her forehead, and yanked against the chains again with strength that was starting to feel less and less like her own.
That'll be spreading fast now.
Henry checked his watch, almost bored.
Feeding time. I should get things ready.
He rose, brushing dirt from his knees, and offered her one last, thin smile.
You made it 2 weeks. That's better than most.
He'd barely turned toward the passage when Chris hit him full force from the shadows, driving him hard into the dirt wall, and the two of them went down in a tangle of limbs while the howls above grew closer, faster, hungrier. "Sissy." Chris got half a word out before Henry's fist caught him across the jaw, and then it was just the sound of struggle, dirt kicked up in clouds, Henry's hand closing around her fallen knife from the shelf and slashing wild toward Chris's face. Chris twisted away, barely, the blade whistling past his ear. Then the passage behind them filled with red. 6 eyes, low and burning amber orange, flooded into the chamber all at once, and everyone, Henry, Chris, even Sissy, straining against her chains, went utterly still. It lasted less than a second. Chris moved first, driving his fist into Henry's already bloodied jaw, wrenching the knife from his slack grip and dragging the blade hard across his cheek as he tore free. Henry howled, and the creature's head swung toward him as one, drawn by the fresh scent of blood in the air, amber eyes narrowing with sudden, terrible interest.
No, wait.
Henry's voice cracked, all its calm control gone in an instant, and then the creatures were on him, and the sound that followed was one Chris would never fully describe to anyone, ever, as long as he lived. He kept his eyes on Sissy instead, hands working frantically at the chain bolted into the brick, sparks of desperation driving him faster than fear ever could. Henry's screaming didn't last long. Then it stopped entirely. The last link gave way just as a soft, wet cracking sound rippled through the chamber, dozens of it all around them. Chris looked down. The eggs. Every single one of them was splitting open at once, thin fissures spreading across leathery shells, something moving restlessly inside each. Sissy's chains fell away, and her eyes met his, wide and terrified in the dim light. "We need to move," she breathed. "Now." The blackness had reached Sissy's collarbone by the time Chris got her upright, heat pouring off her skin in waves, her whole body trembling with something that felt less like injury now and more like transformation. She stumbled and he caught her, pulling her arm over his shoulder and taking her weight without hesitation. "Leave me," she managed, voice thick, unsteady. "Chris, go." Not a chance. He didn't look back at her, didn't slow down. We're doing this together or not at all. Behind them, the first fissures in the nearest eggs split wide open, small shapes unfolding, wet and hungry and already snarling. They half ran, half stumbled into the tunnel, and Chris's flashlight chose that exact moment to flicker once, twice, and die completely, plunging them into total blackness. Sissy's ragged breathing was the only sound besides the distant chittering closing in behind them. "The camera?" Chris said, fumbling it up by its strap. "It's all we've got." He fired it once, a burst of white light and a mechanical whir that felt deafeningly loud in the silence, just long enough to catch the shape of the passage ahead before darkness swallowed them again. Sissy's skin had gone strange under that flash, scaled and dark along the edges of her wound, spreading further with every labored breath she took. Chris felt along the tunnel floor with his boot, searching for his trail of crumpled paper, and found it. All of it, balled together in a single pile, kicked deliberately into a heap that told him everything he needed to know. Henry. Even dead, the bastard had made sure they'd never find their way out. The chittering behind them grew louder, closer, dozens of small, clawed feet skittering over packed earth. Sissy's knees buckled without warning, and Chris barely caught her before she hit the ground, her whole body seizing violently in his arms, eyes rolled back, black veins now reaching all the way to her jaw. "Sissy." He cradled her against him, camera forgotten, the tunnel walls seeming to close in from every direction. "Stay with me, please." The hatchlings reached them first, small, vicious, teeth bared, and Chris threw himself over her without thinking, felt the first bite tear into his shoulder, another at his calf, pain blooming white-hot through the dark. He heard his camera clatter away, out of reach, and braced for whatever came next. Then Sissy's eyes snapped open. They burned amber orange in the pitch black, bright enough to cast faint light across the tunnel walls, and the howl that tore out of her throat wasn't anything close to human. Every hatchling froze. Even the three larger creatures arriving at the mouth of the passage behind them stopped dead in their tracks. She rose in one fluid motion Chris had no name for and threw herself into them with a strength that sent hatchlings scattering into the walls. Two of the larger creatures turned and fled without a second thought. The third lunged, and Sissy met it head-on, twisting through the air, claws Chris hadn't known she had raking through it in a single motion until there was nothing left standing. Then silence. Chris shielded his eyes, chest heaving, and when he lowered his arm again, Sissy was crouched over him, human again, her eyes back to their usual brown, panic replacing whatever had just moved through her. Chris, stay with me." Her hands found his shoulder wound, pressing hard, and whatever strength had carried her through the fight carried him now, lifted clean off the ground in her arms as she drove upward through packed earth and grass and out into open air, bursting free onto the green near Hole 2, right where they'd left the cart hours before. Dawn was breaking pale gold over Club Paradise as she laid him across the back seat, floored the pedal, and sped off toward the hospital with the wind screaming past them and Chris drifting in and out of consciousness beside her. Chris woke to fluorescent light and the steady beep of a monitor, his shoulder wrapped tight, his whole body aching in ways he didn't have names for. Sissy sat in the chair beside his bed, dark circles under her eyes, watching him with an expression somewhere between relief and something heavier. "Hey," she said softly. Don't try to sit up. The documents, he rasped. Did you? I read enough. Her jaw tightened. Chris, it's bigger than the club. Way bigger. Those tunnels, they don't stop at the property line. They run for miles, under half the town. She swallowed hard. Summer Falls isn't safe. None of it is. The television mounted in the corner of his room flickered to a local news broadcast. Club Paradise's front gate wrapped in police tape. A reporter standing grim-faced before the cameras.
Police say 2 individuals broke into the property overnight, vandalizing club offices and making off with several items. Club owner Sam Guest says he won't rest until those responsible are found.
Chris stared at the screen, understanding settling over him cold and heavy. Nobody was coming to save them. Worse, nobody would ever believe them, not with guests already painting them as criminals before they'd said a word. Sissy's hand tightened around the edge of the blanket, and when Chris looked over at her, her eyes had gone bright amber orange in the fluorescent light, gone and then back again in the space of a blink. This isn't over, she said quietly. She turned to look at him, and Chris felt something warm flicker behind his own eyes, saw it reflected back in the sudden widening of her stare. He smiled, sharp fangs gleaming back at her. We're doing this together.